The room was warm with light and applause. Crystal chandeliers glanced off white napkins and champagne flutes. It should have been an anniversary. A small circle of friends, a cake with a single candle, laughter in the corners. Instead, Ethan Walker rose from his chair as if taking a stage. A smile trained into place, and the joke everyone mistook for bravado fell like a stone. "I want a divorce," he said, slow and clean, folding his words like paper. Then he slid an envelope across the table. He tapped it so the room would look, and when the cameras of the couple 3 seats over leaned in, Ethan introduced Vanessa Cole with the ease of someone announcing a promotion. Vanessa stood, perfectly composed, her glamour the kind that shows up like a headline. The laughter died in a neat, clinical silence. Clare Hail felt nothing theatrical in that moment, only the precise cold of breath caught somewhere between chest and throat. She sat very still, hands on the tablecloth, the small blue dress she had chosen that evening, suddenly too small a thing to hold what she felt inside. Around her, faces shifted like leaves in wind, cousins, colleagues, acquaintances whose warmth had always been measured. Ethan's act had been public, the kind of rupture meant to be witnessed. She slid out of the chair before the applause could swell, before anyone could perform the rituals of shock, and left without fanfare. The restaurant's velvet curtains swallowed her. The kitchen door clanked behind her. The cool night air hit her face, and she walked to the curb with a measured step. She did not cry. She did not shout. She did what she'd promised herself she would do the moment the facade revealed the crack. She left with her dignity intact. She called her father. The voice that answered on the 3rd ring was low and careful. Richard Hale listened, and in a way that never felt like rescue, promised a ride. A black car arrived within 20 minutes. Claire slid into the back seat and looked back only once at the glittering street, at the small pockets of light where strangers lived and loved, oblivious to the collision at table 12. She had hidden the fact of her lineage from everyone in town, from the neighbors who assumed they knew by the modesty of her apartment, from the friends who never saw the private wings of anonymity she'd insisted on, and from Ethan, who had loved the woman he believed Claire to be. She had done it on purpose. She had wanted normalcy, to be someone defined not by money or by a name, but by the slow work of ordinary life. The Hale estate gate opened like a breath. Claire's father met her in the foyer with no questions, only a hands-on-the-shoulders steadiness that said business first, then consolation. He wrapped her in an embrace the way people do when they mean to make a world safe again. Quietly, she explained what had happened. Quietly, she let him see the bruise of humiliation she had kept polished into a plain face. Richard did not promise punishment. He said they would do what was right. Over the next days, calm replaced outrage. There were no tabloid splashes at the gate, no dramatic press conferences. Claire did not want spectacle. She wanted answer and, if it came, accountability. Linda Brooks, Richard's lawyer, sharp, unflashy, efficient, took a copy of the envelope Ethan had produced that night and set to work like a surgeon handling a case file. She found an ordinary thread and pulled. There were layers to the way the Hale family sheltered their assets. Trusts with named beneficiaries, holding companies with operating agreements, convertible notes placed in promising startups. At a glance, these read like financial opacity. Under Linda's scrutiny, they revealed ordinary legal pathways. The house Ethan had believed he owned outright, the one with his signature on a mortgage, had been purchased years earlier by a holding company controlled by Hale Holdings. Occupancy rights had been granted to Ethan through a long-term lease contingent on marital goodwill. The fleet of cars parked in Ethan's garage were registered to a management company whose beneficiary, on paper, was Claire. The loans Ethan used to start his firm had Hale Investments as a backer. There were clauses allowing conversion to shares under defined default conditions. None of it sounded like vengeance. None of it sounded swift and arbitrary. It sounded procedural and inevitable in the way contracts become when the contingencies they spell out are triggered. Linda drew up notices, prepared declarations, and made calls that set things in motion. Richard made one phone call to ensure that everything would be handled quietly, legally, and with the dignity Clare insisted upon. For a short while, the world watched the aftermath play out like a slow-motion scene. Representatives arrived at Ethan's front door quietly, with printed letters and service badges that looked official. They did not barge in. They presented legal documents, notices of tenancy termination, statements proving title, transfers of management authority. Management codes were changed through the building's administrator. Alarm panels were reprogrammed by authorized security technicians after the firm reviewed account ownership. Utilities are not a matter of will. They are accounts held by named parties on file. When the named party on a single water account was established to be a trust that reported to Clare, a service agreement was rerouted according to the law and the signed paperwork. Vanessa unpacked her heels at the doorway, dragging a suitcase behind her. Ethan fumbled with keys that no longer responded. The pair sat on a couch now, formally and legally considered temporary occupants, reading notices their lawyer had the right to render. There was no joyful gloating from Clare. There was an official process, a quiet handover done with clipboard signatures and polite instructions for the movers. Stewardship had shifted. The house did not belong to Ethan in any legal sense that could stand against the documentation Linda presented. He had believed otherwise. He had not known. The first days after the eviction were noisy elsewhere. Investors began to ask questions about management stability, not unreasonably. Rumors spread about leadership. Boards are brittle under gossip and under the weight of uncertain revenue. Hail Investments, which had been a quiet early backer in Ethan's firm, had the option to convert debt into equity if certain covenants were broken. Those covenants, meeting revenue targets, demonstrating fiduciary stability, were not met. When a string of clients pulled their commitments in reaction to the public spectacle, Ethan's company hit a liquidity dip. Debt protection clauses kicked in. There were conversations, then votes, then a formal notification that Hail Investments would convert its position into a controlling stake, subject to board approval. This did not happen overnight. Clare watched from a study window as spreadsheets and board minutes collected like the signatures on a long document. There were conference calls, a deadline here, a due diligence there. It took weeks of legal work and negotiation, of investor communications and corporate filings. Linda's team moved with the kind of patience that makes results irreversible. Letters of intent, signed purchase agreements, escrow accounts funded against performance. When the acquisition closed, it was an acquisition like any other. Contracts exchanged, funds wired, titles updated. Clare's company became the principal shareholder. Ethan's role within the firm, once so comfortably assumed, was a subject of corporate policy and human resources guidelines. Meanwhile, Ethan's world eroded in smaller, more human ways. Friends he had counted on for mutual vanity drifted away. He called old colleagues and found voicemail. The mortgage company asked questions about payment defaults. The bank offered restructuring at a rate that felt like punishment. He rented a small, inexpensive motel room for a time. Pride, which had once looked like a coat he wore for warmth, now sat at the foot of the bed like an unconstellated weight. He applied for work, received polite rejections, and found himself increasingly visible to the same people who had seen him at the anniversary table. Only now they saw him as an ex-husband with a diminished balance sheet. When Clare's acquisition finalized, it was presented as the clean business decision it was. A controlling stake had found a rational steward. There were board meetings where the terms were laid out. Clare, as the majority owner, wanted stability and a team that could deliver. She wanted the company to survive and to thrive. She wanted accountability. Ethan was offered a path, a junior role with training and supervision, a chance to rebuild a career in the field he had once led. It was not generosity in the theatrical sense. It was leverage converted into the human equivalent of a probationary period. He took it with a bruised pride hiding under a thin smile. He showed up to a modest desk in a glass-squared office that overlooked a street he had once thought would always look up to him. Claire walked into that room once, not for spectacle, but for finality. She did not thunder accusations. She did not gleefully catalogue his failures. She reviewed his file, then looked at him with the same steady focus she had shown the evening he left. "Your performance has been below expectation," she said. Her voice had no sweetness and no malice. "You are assigned to the transition team to rebuild client relationships. If you cannot meet the standards required, your position will be terminated." It was businesslike, efficient, humane in a way most punishments are not. For a moment Ethan's face reddened, then went flat. He tried to appeal to the memory of their marriage, to the years he believed they had built together. Claire listened, and for a heartbeat let the memory stand as a soft background. Then she closed the ledger. Weeks later, when his numbers did not improve, she executed the termination. It was the clearest possible mirror of consequence. Poor management had cost him his company. Poor choices had cost him trust. She signed the paper and handed it to a human resources representative. "We wish you well," she said, and turned back toward a life she had refused to make small for anyone else. Claire did not gloat at his fall. She felt sometimes a ripple of sorrow when she thought of the man who had once painted their life with ordinary domesticity, and then, in one performative act, decided to repaint it for an audience. She felt the quiet adjustment of a person who had watched a private humiliation become public, and then let the law do its work. Her actions had not been about revenge. They were about what dignity looks like when it is defended, measured, legal, and proportionate. Vanessa left town within months. There were no scandal sheets screaming about a failed romance. People moved on, as people do. Ethan found odd jobs, consulting gigs for a while, and then a modest position that paid decently enough. He slept in apartments that had simple curtains rather than chandeliers. That, too, is a kind of education. There were words that Claire kept for herself. She had married Ethan because she loved him, because she believed a life shared with him would be rich in ways money cannot purchase. For years she had hidden her name because she wanted him to love the woman who cooked his eggs and paid the bills honestly, not the story that came with a last name. She regretted that her secrecy had been at the cost of trust when it mattered most. But she did not regret the choice to live as she had wished to live. On a quiet night, months after the divorce announcement, Claire stood at a window of an office that had once belonged to the company Ethan had built. City lights spilled like scattered coins. She had a hot drink in her hands. She thought of the way people conflate possession with value. She thought of the neat arithmetic by which society measures worth, houses, cars, titles. She thought of dignity and how it is sometimes mistaken for timidity. She had the chance to let the story be about spectacle. Instead, she had let it be about law and order and restoration. She had called on the structures that exist precisely to preserve fairness. She had used contracts and clauses, corporate governance and trust instruments, not to humiliate but to ensure accountability. The consequence of Ethan's public betrayal was proportionate. He lost what he had misread as permanent and was invited legally and practically to rebuild. There were people who would call what she did cold. There were people who, in the privacy of their comments and conversations, wished for a more theatrical reckoning. Claire understood both impulses and refused them. The lesson she let stand was simpler and sharper. Never shrink yourself so another person can stand taller. That is not a demand for retribution. It is a boundary set by someone who knows her own worth. When asked later by a friend why she had concealed her identity for so long, she answered simply, to be loved for who she was, not for what she represented. When asked if she felt triumphant at Ethan's diminished state, she shook her head. Triumph felt small. Justice, when it is calm and lawful, felt like balance restored. There was a difference. The title of the story, that he had no idea his wife was the trillionaire's daughter before leaving her for another woman, carried with it the pinch of irony that made good copy. But the truth beneath that line was something quieter and more complicated. Clare had deliberately made room for ordinary love, and when the ordinary required protection, she used every lawful means at her disposal to enforce it. She did not orchestrate the public breaking, she responded to it. She enforced consequences aligned with the breach. In the end, she watched the city lights and felt an odd, steady peace. It was not peace won by watching another stumble. It was peace that came from standing up for oneself without losing kindness. She had kept her dignity when it would have been easier to perform outrage. She had reclaimed what was hers by every legal measure a modern world allows. She had learned and taught in the same motion that hiding one's identity to preserve love is a complex gamble, and that when someone betrays that trust publicly, the remedy is sober and proportionate, not petty spectacle. If this story moved you, tap like and subscribe. Tell us below, what would you have done if you were in Clare's shoes?